Great. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Worldviews. Today we have on Graham Oppy. Graham is a philosophy professor at Monash University. He specializes in the philosophy of religion and has had many debates and discussions with prominent religious and non-religious figures from all over the world. Graham, thanks for coming on Worldviews.
Oh, thanks for inviting me on.
Of course. Graham, can you first just give us a background of your religious upbringing and how you found philosophy, along with how you came to the conclusion of your current worldview?
Sure. So, uh, at least for the Oppies, religion goes back a long way because the Oppies were miners in Cornwall and they were evangelised by the Wesleys way back. And so there's a strong history of Methodism in my family, which persisted through to my parents. So I was brought up going to Methodist church and Sunday school. And when I was about 13, I discovered that I didn't believe the things that my parents believed at the time. And I stopped being religious. And maybe 2 or 3 years after that, I discovered philosophy. And it's a long story to get from being 16 and interested in philosophy to I became a professor when I was 46. I mean, it's kind of long and not particularly interesting story, so I might just leave it there.
Okay, so you abandoned your Christianity. You said you were 13,
Yeah, roundabout.
and then around 16 you discovered philosophy.
Yeah.
Okay, so for you, you've had many years of experience, obviously, within philosophy. What would you say is the most useful thing philosophy has taught you over all your years of experience?
Um, so that's really tricky. It's kind of an ambiguous question because there's one thing about what you learn by being a philosopher, being a professional philosopher, and there's another question about what philosophical claims are kind of most important to you. A lot of the stuff that I've done in philosophy, thinking about um, questions in logic, metaphysics, and so on, don't really have much practical application. But the kind of trajectory to get from being interested in philosophy to end up being a professional philosopher, you learn a lot along the way because um, it's a long journey. Lots of people are there at the beginning. Very few make it to the end. It's like lots of things. There's a funnel. And so you learn lots of lessons about things like not giving up.
Yeah, and I'm also curious too, because surely when it comes to philosophy, there's so much obviously existential thinking across the board with these numerous topics you have to wrestle with. For you, what's the most challenging philosophical topic you have wrestled with?
Um, I don't think there's anything in philosophy that's easy. Uh, the part of the reason why I say that is because if something's a philosophical question, it means that we haven't yet figured out um, really what's the right way to even go about answering the question. Never mind settling on an answer to it. Um, there are philosophical questions that are challenging in different ways, and some of them are just it's just that they're intellectually hard, but other ones are hard because they deal with um, topics that you're emotionally or psychologically invested in. So one of the things about teaching courses on arguments about the existence of God is that lots of people have a view, lots of people have an investment um, there, and so that can make the discussion difficult.
Yeah, and when you do teach this, teach about philosophical arguments for God and whatnot, do your students ever try to debate you?
Um, so I guess I don't really do debates. I do discussions, and of course we have discussions in class. Nothing's off limits in a classroom. The only requirement is that people are civil, respect one another, and then because we know before we start that there's huge differences in opinion, right, about things that lots of people think are quite important. And this isn't just true for philosophy of religion, it's true in political philosophy, it's true in other areas of philosophy as well.
Interesting. Yeah, because I would figure that most of your students are not religious, or is that wrong?
I think that uh, it's probably not right. So um, the students don't have to declare what they believe, and you can argue about arguments without disclosing what your own opinion is. I mean, you can argue about whether, for example, an argument's valid without disclosing what your view is, and you can argue that there's a range of reasonable opinion without disclosing what your view is, right? So um, students don't say. So what I'm going on is this. In Australia, we've had so federation was 1901. We had a census then. We had one every 10 years till, I don't know, maybe it was in the 1940s, and then we had one every 5 years after that. And what the census figures show is that back in 1901, 97% of people ticked the box that said their religion was Christianity. And at the most recent census, just over 50% of people tick that box. And there are other religions that have risen a bit. So Muslim about 2%, Jewish
Mm,
a bit under 1%, and so on. But the population now is, I think, getting close to dividing half and half between people who are religious and people who are not. And it would be surprising if that wasn't reflected in my class, right? So uh, maybe there's some difference from the population average, but I know from talking to lots of people that lots of students that take my class are religious.
mm. Cool. Well, honestly, before we go forward, I want to dig a little bit more into your upbringing with it, because I know for you, I assume when you first left Christianity, you probably had a lot of fear of the implications of that, whether it's through family dynamics or your worry of the spiritual implications too, at least at the time.
Um, no, I actually didn't. I didn't get pushback from my family, and I, I mean, maybe it would be different if you were older. I was only 12 or 13 at the time, and it didn't it didn't seem to me that having realised that I didn't believe, it didn't seem to me that that was dreadful. It was just different.
Did you have a lot of friends that were Christians as well, or were they kind of all over the board?
Um, yes, and there were school teachers who knew that I didn't believe. I had very interesting conversations. There was one teacher, so when I was in year 10, so I was about 16, gave me a copy of Pascal's Ponces and asked me to read the wager argument, which I did, and I wasn't exactly overwhelmed by it. So yeah, it wasn't it wasn't something like a dark secret.
Okay. So I had Joe Schmidt on the show as well. I think you know him. We
Yeah.
talked a little bit about the whole Pascal's wager. Do you actually think that's an argument? Because it just seems like a statement more than it doesn't seem like an actual worthy argument for God. It just seems like it's a threat almost.
So it's not an argument for the existence of God. It's an argument that the rational bet to make is to bet on God.
Yeah.
And it is an argument for that. Pascal uh, was a very smart, super impressive person. And one of the things that he essentially did was he invented probability theory and decision theory when he produced the wager argument. And decision theory is a huge ongoing endeavor. It turns out, I think, that the argument that he kind of pressed decision theory into service of was not a good argument, but the the idea that you could make decision theory that decision theory would be a useful tool was
Interesting. Yeah, I just every time I hear Pascal's wager, I'm just like, I just feel like that's so much different than all the other arguments for God, and I don't know. I just always go back with them. I just never even talk about that one as an argument because it just sounds like an immediate threat towards someone that doesn't believe. But yeah. Anyway, so your school then, it sounds like it was a Christian school that you were at.
Um, okay, so it was called Wesley College, right? So it was nominally a Methodist school, but the school system in Melbourne is interesting. There are a lot of private schools, and lots of them have very loose historical associations with particular, generally Protestant denominations. I mean, there's a bunch of Catholic schools, but the Catholic schools are kind of a separate system. And it was, apart from a kind of chapel service once a week, there was nothing that marked it out as particularly religious.
Hmm. Okay. And then since you've been in your belief around 13, found philosophy. What about philosophy though itself was so attractive to you?
Okay, so first, initially, one of the things that happened was another one of the teachers at the school gave me a
Okay.
copy of Bertrand Russell's autobiography, which is a great big book. And I read it through, and I was really impressed by certain aspects of Russell's life. I mean, there were things about him that were not so likable, and that's kind of inevitable. People are complex. But I was really impressed by his pursuit of mathematics and philosophy. And at that point, I kind of formed a vague idea that I would like that if things worked out right, that I'd like to do something like what Russell had done and pursue the things that he'd done. So that was a kind of getting interested in philosophy by way of being interested in a particular person who was a philosopher.
Mm,
It took longer before I got a kind of clear idea that there were issues in philosophy that I was really interested in thinking about.
mm, Issues such as what?
Issues such as, well, one of them that I eventually came to, of course, was a whole lot of questions about religious belief and the existence of God and things like that. But there's a whole range of topics that I eventually became interested in and worked on. Some questions in aesthetics about the nature of art, some questions in metaphysics about time and causation, and a bunch of other things. Uh, and most recently, a bunch of questions about arguments, about what makes for a good argument, and about what's involved in thinking well, thinking critically,
Mm,
stuff like that.
yeah. And also, when you moved away from Christianity, did you want it to be real, or were you totally fine with it being non-existent?
Um, so once I once I discovered that I didn't believe it, I mean, and this happened quite quickly in a period of a few weeks. Um, I didn't I never thought, it's sad or regrettable that I don't believe. Right? It wasn't like it was difficult or traumatic. Um, I, as I told you, I'd gone to Sunday school and to church. Um, and once I decided I didn't believe, it was fine that I didn't go. I didn't miss them and I didn't miss it.
Mm, mm. And for your colleagues currently, I imagine that there's a lot of different perspectives and worldviews amongst them. Your ones at your current university, or do a lot of them share an atheistic worldview?
Uh, so not all of them are atheists, but there's probably more atheists amongst my colleagues than there are in the population at large. But that's kind of an accident. So when I was an undergraduate at Melbourne Uni, the department there split about 50-50. maybe slightly more religious believers than not. Um, Whereas there are other Australian universities, I mean, some of which are quite small, where back in the 60s there were a bunch of Maoists and they were all atheists. So, it just depends.
Oh, interesting. And I'm curious too, as an atheist, what do you think, what challenges you the most about being under that worldview?
Sorry, I missed the last bit.
What challenges you the most about being under the worldview of atheism?
Um, so I guess I don't really think that atheism's a worldview. Atheism is just really accepting a proposition, the claim that there aren't any gods. The worldview that I embrace, I would call naturalism. The view that there's roughly the causal world as described by physics, and there's nothing else causal apart from that. That's what I take to be central to my worldview. That rules out lots of things. It's not just that it rules out God with a capital G and gods with a small g. It rules out all kinds of other things that lots of people believe in. Um, Fortune telling, ghosts, lots of things.
Yeah, you don't believe in ghosts, huh? Would you, could you be swayed, do you think, if you had some kind of supernatural encounter? Or
Um,
would you leave it up to some kind of hallucination?
so it's kind of hard to know what hard to talk about what would happen if you had kinds of experiences that you don't have and that you don't think anybody else has and that you don't think it's possible to have. It's hard to know what the right response would be. So Hume speculated about what if there was this voice from the sky and it spoke to everybody in their own language and it said, I am the Lord your God, blah, 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 blah. Well, I don't know what you would think in those circumstances. Maybe that could only happen if there was a God. Um, and so maybe the appropriate thing would be to believe but if you think about our world, and given what I think about it, I just think there's zero chance that that's going to happen, right? There's no mechanism that can make a single signal be interpretable by people all over the world, no matter what language they speak, right? The story's just not coherent. And that's what I would have said to Hume. Your story doesn't even make sense.
Mm. So then you would probably, I would say, leave up any type of, well, I guess there's been millions of people that have claimed to go through some kind of supernatural encounter, whether it's seeing angels, God, near death experiences, and whatnot. I would assume that you would answer those people by saying it was all some kind of brain malfunction or something along those lines. Uh, but, or
Um,
would you disagree?
not brain, not. I wouldn't say brain dysfunction. There's a bunch of things that are relevant. Um, Lots of people believe what other people tell them about their experiences. So there are lots of people who are Christians who have never had the experience of being in the presence of the Lord, if you want to put it like that. There are well-known philosophers. Bill Alston was one, and I think Elton Plantinga was another, who both said in their kind of intellectual autobiographies that they never experienced, they never saw God, right? And that's not that uncommon. But they believed other people who said that they'd seen God, right? So there's that kind of case. And there, what I want to say is that they weren't necessarily irrational when they believed what other people told them about those experiences, but nonetheless, they formed false belief as a result. Okay, so that's one kind of case. The other kind of case that you're interested in is where people have experiences of certain kinds and themselves, on the basis of those experiences, draw certain conclusions about, let's say, about the supernatural. Now, it depends what we're talking about. Uh, the um, so I've been thinking about things like mediums. You know, people who claim to talk to the dead and things like that. And there's a kind of interesting question about the extent to which. So in the 19th century, mediumship was a big deal. There were lots of people who claimed to be mediums, and most of them ended up getting prosecuted and sent to jail. Um, and so there's this kind of interest for because they were frauds, right? And it was eventually discovered that they were frauds. There's a question about whether about what's going on with people like that, whether it's just that there are kind of motivations that are so strong that you kind of give into temptations that you shouldn't give into, or whether there's a kind of self-deception that's going on, a kind of self-deception that in other cases would be harmless, that leads them to believe that they've got powers that they don't actually have. So there's that kind of case. Then there are cases that you might be talking about where people have kind of anomalous perceptual experiences. There's lots of cases like this. I mean, there's all kinds of ways, like drop some acid, right, and get really drunk. Get really tired, don't sleep for 4 or 5 days. Get really hungry, don't eat for a week. All of those kinds of things can produce really quite anomalous experiences, which you then might interpret in a way that other people wouldn't interpret them. In those cases, again, it's not obvious that you're making some sort of terrible mistake if you don't reflect on the fact that actually, given the circumstances that you're in, it will be best not to treat these experiences as evidence for much of anything. So there's a range of things to say. It's not straightforward, and every case would, if you've got a particular case that you're interested in, you need to look into it in some detail.
Mm, mm. Okay, so you've obviously given a lot of thought to this and all these issues together. Do you even doubt your naturalistic worldview anymore? Or do you think, are you 100% firm, would you say?
Um, I don't think I've ever had, since I was 13, I don't think that I've ever sort of had thoughts about, oh, maybe this isn't the right view. However, I think that it would be clearly a mistake to say that you couldn't reasonably disagree with me. Right? So we have to distinguish perhaps two different considerations here. One is about whether there's something like proof or overwhelming reason that everybody can share in that would tell them that my worldview is the one they should coordinate on. I don't think that there's anything like that. On the other hand, I think that it's perfectly fine for people who have a particular position to be, unmoved by considerations that move other people. So, in that sense, I'm just reporting how it is with me. I don't have doubts.
You said you don't?
I don't about my worldview.
Mm, mm. So then when you weigh these arguments for God, do you just, I assume you see them all as the same, as similar levels of quality, or do you think there's one that's above like the rest of the main ones?
So that's I think it's kind of hard to think about ranking them on a kind of ordinal scale according to quality. Uh, some of the arguments are interesting, and the ones that are interesting in different ways. So Anselm's ontological argument remains interesting because it's so hard to get a handle on the argument. But you have this little bit of text, and then there's other stuff that Anselm wrote that provides some background to it. And that when you read their argument, it has a superficial plausibility, but when you dig into it and you try to kind of give it a really concrete representation, uh, it's very slippery, right? So it has an attraction, right? That after 1,000 years, very few people think that the final word has been said on that argument. There are other arguments. So Gödel's ontological arguments. So I'm just sticking in the domain of ontological arguments at the moment, which is interesting in a different way. It's because Gödel produced it, you can be pretty confident that that in the ballpark there's a kind of logically solid argument. But I think in that case that it's pretty clear why the argument's not a convincing argument, but other people disagree. I think that there's a kind of clear difference between Gödel's argument and Anselm's argument, because I think in the case of Anselm's argument, it's quite hard to pinpoint why it is that most people have thought that that argument's not really convincing. It's slippery, but you can't really say why. Whereas I think in the case of Gödel's argument, you can say why. So that's some sorts of considerations. Consider other arguments. Consider the fine-tuning argument, or the argument from psychophysical harmony, or one of the various cosmological arguments, the arguments from contingency, for example. They're all interesting in different ways, right? They're all interesting arguments.
Can you, for our audience and for the sake of myself, because I still have such a hard time wrapping my head around the ontological argument, can you explain it like I'm 5 years old, what that argument means?
So the most important thing to know about ontological arguments is there are many different kinds of them, right? And so I can explain an ontological argument to you, but if you want to have them all explained in detail, we'll be here until tomorrow. So perhaps the simplest argument is one that perhaps is in Anselm, but probably didn't really get developed until Charles Hartshorne was writing some stuff in about the 1950s. So this is the modal ontological argument, a particular kind of modal ontological argument, because there are many different arguments of this kind. So Hartshorne, the kind of core of Hartshorne's argument is this. Here's a principle about God that many theists find plausible. Necessarily, if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists, right? So it has to be that God exists, and it has to be that if there's a God, then it has to be that God exists. Okay, so that's the kind of starting principle. Because this is formulated in terms of necessity, that when we've got our argument, we're going to need modal logic to assess it. Here's how the argument goes. Possibly God exists. Necessarily, if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists. Therefore, and now you can choose what you want the conclusion to be, God exists, necessarily God exists. Right? Either of those will do as a conclusion. How do you get from the two premises to the conclusion? Well, if your background logic is a strong enough modal logic, it's just guaranteed that the conclusion follows from the premises. I'm not sure that I want to try to go into the details of that now, but if we configure the whole thing in terms of possible worlds, so think of something claims necessarily true if it's true in all possible worlds, then, and a claim's possibly true if it's true in at least one possible world. Go back to the premise. The first premise was possibly God exists, so there's seven possible worlds where God exists. Necessarily, if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists. If there's even one world in which God exists, then God exists in all of them. Right, that's what that means. But where the first premise was God exists in at least one world, and the second premise is if God exists in at least one world, exists in all of them. Conclusion: God exists in all worlds, and hence, in particular, exists in our world. So that's why both necessarily God exists and God exists follow. Right? So that's the. I mean, it's easier to see the argument when you say it in terms of possible worlds, right? Because it's very easy to see that if God exists in at least one world, and if God exists in one world, he exists in all worlds. From those two claims, it follows that God exists in all worlds. So it's easy to see that the argument is valid. And also, it's sort of plausible that that second claim, if necessarily if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists, is kind of stipulative. You can just take that to be kind of definition of God. It's not one that all theists will accept, but many do. There are lots of necessary being theists, people who think that if there's a God, it's necessary that God exists and that that's a necessary truth. So that means all the interest in this argument is in the first claim, not that it's possible that God exists or God exists in at least one possible world. And the difficulty for the argument is that kind of everybody knows that if you don't believe in the necessary God, you think that that God's impossible, doesn't exist in any worlds, right? So the argument, people are just going to divide on that first premise. People who already believe in the necessary God are going to accept the premise. Those who disbelieve are going to reject it. And the people who are agnostic is just going to be agnostic about it. Right? So the argument's kind of not going to do any useful work. You can't use it to persuade people. You can't be persuaded out of agnosticism or atheism by this argument, because the first premise is one that either you reject or you're agnostic about. The other thing is about this argument, suppose you replace the premise with the claim that it's possible that God doesn't exist. Right? So there's at least one world in which God doesn't exist. The second premise was if God exists in at least one world, he exists in all of them. But if he doesn't exist in one world, then he clearly doesn't exist in all of them. So he doesn't exist in any. So the conclusion now from possibly God doesn't exist and that central claim is that God doesn't exist, and in fact it's necessary that God doesn't exist. So the atheist has an argument that they can give back to the theist that's just as strong as the argument that the theist gave to them. Right? So that's another reason for thinking that this modal ontological argument isn't a good argument.
Wow, that is a whole lot. I'm I'm curious too. Then, when you engage in these arguments, have people try to present you the argument for the resurrection as an argument for God's existence?
So there's a bunch of arguments. So there's the case that the McGrews make. There's the case that William Lane Craig makes. There's a bunch of people who try to make a kind of case for this historical argument from the alleged veridicality of claims about the resurrection to the existence of God, at any rate to the truth of Christianity. So yeah, I'm familiar with those arguments. I've read some of them, thought about some of them.
Do you do you hold any noble opinions on Jesus Christ himself? Do you think he was just a wise teacher, or do you think he never existed at all, or any other type of explanation for who he was?
So it's kind of interesting what to say about the origins of Christianity. So, as you know, the evidence that we've got is basically Paul's letters and the Gospels, and there's kind of no other real evidence in the first century, and there's no archaeological evidence for about 150 years. So it's kind of so what you've got is some texts, right? And for most historians, texts on their own going to be good evidence for some things, not good evidence for other things. In particular, where you've got ancient texts that make claims about miraculous events, events that by naturalistic lights, um, you know, the most reasonable thing to think is that the claims are mistaken. Most historians, so I'm in a school of history and philosophy, and the historians wouldn't suppose that there's none of them would suppose that there's strong evidence for the kind of supernatural claims that are made in the Gospels. And that's kind of the position that I would take. That means when it comes to Jesus, I'm not sure, because there's no other evidence, which bits of the text are right and which bits are wrong, except that the bits that make the claims to miracles are wrong, right? So that leaves it open. What leaves it quite open? What was true in the story, in the stories that came forward? It seems to me unlikely that the only claims that were false are the ones that naturalists won't believe, because they're kind of claims to supernatural things that never actually happen, like the feeding a multitude with a handful of pieces of bread and a couple of fish, right? That's something that just can't happen. That's just a story. But there's lots of stuff in there, lots of stuff in the Gospels that talks about real places around the Mediterranean, talks about, in some cases, people that actually existed, and so on. So I think that and here I'm kind of reasonably close to, I think, the position that Vardaman has. Right. There's some factual basis for some of it, but it's a bit hard to know what's factual and what isn't, aside from the stuff that's supernatural.
Hmm. Sorry, say again. So, what was your overall position on Jesus? Just can you repeat what you said the last part? What was your overall position on Jesus? Your overall thoughts, I
So
guess.
it's kind of hard to know
Hard. Okay.
what in exactly what's factual and what isn't. Setting aside the supernatural stuff, which I'm just going to go and say that's not factual.
Mm, mm. When's the last time you opened up a Bible, you think?
Sorry, I missed that too.
I'm curious. When's the last time you think you opened up a Bible?
It would have been pretty recently.
Oh,
So I, so I'm trying to think, what was I looking for? I read lots of stuff that quotes the Bible. So often enough, I want to check. So I own several Bibles.
mm,
I have a really big, very old. It's a family Bible, King James. It's a leather-bound, enormous Bible, but it's not the most convenient book. I mean, it'll be a hassle to carry it around because it's so large. I have a much smaller RSV that I was given when I was at Sunday school, which is the one that I use as a kind of standard.
oh,
And yeah, I would look things up in it fairly
mm, interesting. Have you ever just read it for any for wisdom purposes?
often. So I like Ecclesiastes, and I used to read that.
Oh, great. That's my favorite. Beautiful.
So, but I've read other bits. I always kind of got defeated, but when I had the idea that I should read the whole thing from beginning to end, um, I would start on Genesis and it would get to the genealogy bit, and I just couldn't. I just couldn't. And I would give up. I did that several times.
Yeah, that I can see that.
Boring, right? I thought I've got better things to do.
Yeah, yeah. The commitment to read the Bible from beginning to end is so much more massive than people realize. I haven't read it from beginning to end. I get stuck a lot in parts of the Old Testament. I haven't dove into the prophets either, but I totally relate to the genealogy section. It's just like it's very challenging to get past a lot of it. And I know from your worldview as an atheist, you're like, well, there's plenty of other stuff I want to do that goes towards other philosophical genres and whatnot. But that's cool. That's interesting. Is your immediate family right now, are any of them Christian? If you have an immediate family,
So my parents died. My mother, so a long time ago now, my mother died in 1991. She was still a Christian when she died, but the morning that she died, she sang her favourite hymn, I Lift Up My Eyes to the Hills. I don't know if you're not Methodist, you probably don't know it anyway. So she remained religious. My father outlived her by about 8 years. After she died, I think his religious belief kind of faded away. Um, in the last part of his life, I think he was, well, it's a bit hard to say. He was kind of a spiritual searcher, but he wasn't a Christian anymore, I don't
hmm.
think. Amongst my siblings, I have three. None of them is religious. My immediate family, so I'm married, I have three kids, none of them
Do you guys engage in philosophical debates over dinner?
are. Occasionally.
Really?
Yeah, well, it's much more of the time, though, it's going to be banter. We prefer comedy to philosophy.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. A dinner at the Oppies discussing ontological arguments for God. That's funny. Uh, cool. And then I'm curious about this too, because as you know, William Lane Craig, I think 4 years ago on a podcast called Pints of Aquinas, said that you are the most formidable atheist. So I want to ask you the question: who do you think is the most formidable or most impressive theist right now?
Yeah, so I get asked this question quite a lot. I wish Bill hadn't said what he said. Um, there, there are lots of people who are really impressive. And um, I mean, if I start, there's a long list of people, and I will leave people out that should be considered. I can give you some names, right? But this list is not complete, and it's not, you know, there might be people who should be on this list even higher up, right? So I think Peter Van Imwagen's a really impressive philosopher. Um, I think John Hawthorne is a really impressive philosopher. They're two people who are theists, but are probably at least as well known for their contributions to philosophy outside philosophy of religion as within it. People who are sort of more squarely philosophers of religion, Alex Proust is super impressive. So is Josh Rasmussen. Um, I think so are Dan Howard Snyder and Mike Bergman. Uh, Bill Craig, very good philosopher. Richard Swinburne's a very good philosopher. So there are lots of people.
How about atheists? Who do you think the smartest atheists today?
So more of them are going to be people that just don't do philosophy of religion. Right? There are lots of people that I know, atheists who are very good philosophers but aren't interested in philosophy of religion at all. Amongst the ones that are interested in philosophy of religion, my old friend Al Hayek, he's written lots of good stuff about Pascal's wager and about miracles, among other things. So there are people who are not believers who are super impressive. Someone like Paul Draper. Draper's not an atheist; he's something else, but he's very well known for what he has to say, defending arguments from evil. He's definitely not um, a believer in an agential God. He thinks that he's got kind of knockdown arguments against that. Uh, Evan Fales is somebody I think is really good. Uh, Perhaps he's not as widely known as he should be. Um, yeah, there are lots of people. Again, it's the same as in the previous case. I'm just going by what immediately comes to mind. I'm leaving out all kinds of people I shouldn't be leaving
Yeah, yeah. And when you were talking about the ontological argument and God of one world being God of most worlds, that whole thing, do you hold any weight to the simulation theory or multiverse theory?
out. Simulation theory, no. I think that that's not at all plausible. So that's a bit like asking me whether I'm kind of worried about Descartes' deceitful demon. And the answer is no. Multiverse. Uh, so I met Anthony Aguirre at a conference and talked to him. So he has this multiverse view. He's a physicist. And I can see that there might be kind of reasons just grounded in physics for thinking that there's a multiverse. And so it would be reckless for me, given that I'm not a physicist, to say that it's impossible that there are good reasons, just good independent reasons, nothing to do with philosophy of religion, just good physical reasons for believing in the multiverse. However, as things stand, I don't think that there's anything like a consensus amongst the experts in physics that there is a multiverse. So, as things stand, I don't believe that there is one. I just think that perhaps this is a question that will get settled one way or the other in coming years, or maybe it'll be just something that stays as an open question.
Mm, mm. I'm curious as well, because since you're a big thinker, you've definitely had to have thought about the idea of aliens existing.
So, so I guess what I think is that if there are aliens, they've been nowhere near us. They probably don't know about us yet. Though there is this interesting question, right? If that's the premise of various recent novels, right? We've sent signals out saying we're here, right? If there is anybody that can receive and interpret those signals and they're anything like us and they have the ability to travel, we're just asking to become, for them to be our overlords, right? Um, so uh, I don't. What I really think is it's pretty unlikely that there are aliens anywhere near us. It's pretty unlikely, and certainly we've never been visited by
Really? You think it's unlikely? That that really shocks me. I just feel like it's incredibly likely. I think it's almost certainly that they exist and that they've even maybe even been here. Do you think it's possible to any degree that there's some kind of, I don't want to say conspiracy because I don't know, that's going to make it sound all jumbled up, but that they have been here and people have seen UFOs in the sky, but they just haven't made this grand reveal just yet for whatever reason?
them. So I don't really give any credence to that. Um, and I guess one of the things that you would expect if there are aliens that have the capacity to get here is that wherever they live, there would be signals coming from where they live that by now we'd be able to detect, which we haven't detected. So, um, there's definitely a lot of stuff that we're pumping out into space that says we're here. We Another thing is the recent research on exoplanets, planets around other stars, hasn't really turned up yet very many likely candidates for um, the development of life, something like us. It's true, we found planets with oceans, but we haven't yet found any planet signals of life. It may be that planets are pretty common around stars. I think that's still not 100% settled, but the evidence is trending in that direction. And so it could well be that there's life elsewhere, right? That doesn't seem super unlikely to me. But we're talking that if the Earth's anything to go by, it may well be that the kind of window in which you have something like the capacity to build spaceships that can travel interstellar distances is just not big enough for any civilization to actually make it happen. But we're not close to getting out of the solar system yet, and who knows whether there'll be in 100 years we'll have any resources that would enable us to do that. Right, so I think if we're at all typical, it's very unlikely that aliens would have visited here.
Mm, Interesting. I just, man, something about it. I just feel like I just think it's super possible. I think it's very likely, but you make pretty good points too. And you've had a very long career in philosophy, obviously. Is there anything that you still want to accomplish as a philosopher?
Yeah, there's lots of papers I haven't written yet that I want to write. There's a book on arguing that's not quite finished. I hope it'll be finished by the middle of next year, maybe sooner. It'd be nice to get that one out. Then I would like to, although maybe this isn't exactly philosophy, I'd like to write a book about the history of atheism as well. I'm not sure exactly what it would be, atheism or just sort of heterodox belief, something like that. So that one might be a retirement project. Who knows?
Mm, mm. And I feel like a lot of your time spent on YouTube doing interviews and discussions is a lot around arguments, philosophy, all these things. But how do you spend your time when you're not philosophizing?
So I spend obviously I spend quite a bit of time with my family. We like playing board games, so there's that. The biggest single thing outside of work is cricket. So I'm secretary of the local cricket club. I have been for the last 15 years. In the summer, I play cricket on Saturdays and Sundays. So it's a very big commitment. I don't know how many more years I'll be able to keep doing that. It's fairly physically demanding, so I may give it up sometime soon, but I don't want to.
Yeah. Yeah. What board games do you play? Are they like the standard ones? I don't know if they're different over there, if you guys still or if you guys have Monopoly too.
So the kind of board games we play aren't as simple as Monopoly. Our favourite game is Terraforming Mars, which is takes 4 or 5 hours to play, and it's quite complicated if you play with the. So the original, games get released and then you get expansions that are released subsequently, and games become more complicated over time. We always play with the kind of maximal expansion for Terraforming Mars. So every time we play it, it's a big investment of time to do it.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of other games that are similar, maybe a little bit. Some of them have a kind of short playing time. Um, I used to during COVID when I did these kinds of talks. All of the board games sat on a shelf behind me, and I got lots of comments from people who could see the various board games and were themselves people who played board games, asking me about which ones I liked the most and which ones I regularly played.
Mm, mm. So it sounds like you spend more time reading board games and not much time doing type of TV shows or movies or anything like that.
I hardly watch television or movies at all. That's not my thing. I listen to music, but I don't. No, I wouldn't have watched a television show in a decade. I sometimes watch live sport on telly. That's it. And I've been to maybe two movies this millennium, something like that. Hardly at all.
Two movies, man. Eh, And also, when it comes to books, what books do you like that are outside of philosophy, whether it's fiction or nonfiction alike?
So I'm since I was reached my mid 20s, I've read much more non-fiction than fiction. I read a huge amount of fiction before then, and I may one day go back to reading fiction again. Uh, I just didn't have enough time to fit it in. So, um, and the non-fiction is all over the place. Um, for a while, I read lots of pop science, especially pop physics, but also sort of, if you like, pop maths, pop biology, all kinds of things like that. Sometimes pop social science, stuff from psychology or sociology, um, varies.
Mm, 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 mm. I do have another. Actually, I'll ask that question last, I think. What would you think you would be doing if you weren't a philosophy professor?
So that's a good question. When I first went to university, I enrolled in medicine, and I was thinking that I would become a psychiatrist. And I spent the year that I was nominally doing medicine reading philosophy, and I decided I was in the wrong place. Um, it's possible that that's a kind of alternative direction that my life could have gone in, that I didn't become an academic, that I became a psychiatrist instead. That seems like the closest. I mean, if I think about the kind of branching paths, I did get through a year of medicine at university and did all right at it. I just decided I should not continue with it.
So you'd be in the medical field, you said? Mm, mm. Okay. I think I had one last question. It's a God question, too. If God came down right now and said, Grandma Oppy, you can ask me one question and I will answer it right here, right now, what would you ask him?
Okay, so I think that what I would like is a detailed, practical plan that would solve the major issues that humanity faces, particularly in connection with climate change, but also in connection with political organisation more broadly. So I want a kind of detailed, stepped out plan that's guaranteed to work to solve those problems. So my question is, can you give me the plan, please?
Interesting. That'd be, is that like your number one question by far? Or is there like a close second?
Yeah, that's my number one question.
Interesting. Cool. Well, cool, Graham. But hey, I really appreciate this again. Do you have any final thoughts for our viewers?
Um, no, I just say thanks again for asking me on. I've enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for putting all the work into thinking of questions to ask.
Oh, of course. Appreciate it, Graham. Thanks for coming on.